Mark Caesar was one of the leaders of what we're calling the Port Tobacco Escape of 1845. He was enslaved by a Charles County, Maryland clerk named John Barnes, who owned multiple properties in Charles County. He was described as being a carpenter, and he was also literate. And it's up for debate at the moment if he was enslaved during the escape alongside the other leader named Bill Wheeler. He was promised emancipation by his enslaver after his death in 1844, which was 1 year before the escape, but he was tried at one of his trials as an enslaved person, so that could have been a motivation for him to be involved in this escape in the first place. Bill Wheeler was owned by a man named Benjamin Conti. They moved to Charles County, Maryland from Virginia in 1830, and they got property in the Newburgh area, which is near the border of Charles County and St. Mary's County. And we know this from an act that allowed Benjamin Conti to bring in enslaved people that he owned from Virginia in the 1830s, and one of those people was named Bill. This incident was in a large-scale escape planned out by Mark Caesar and Bill Wheeler on July 7th, 1845. This was an escape of 30 to 70 enslaved people from Charles County and St. Mary's County, possibly other places in Maryland. It started out near Port Tobacco in the daytime, which is quite significant for people to escape at that time. Usually people would leave their plantation or their site of enslavement at night to ensure extra cover, to make it easier to hide, but this was during the daytime. It was noted in multiple newspapers. They left Charles County in an open road near a thickly dense neighborhood, it was noted, and they left for DC.
In DC, they were actually pushed out of DC. Specifically, their route actually took them to what is known as a street in DC called 7th Street. Now, this street still existed. However, the problem is that we don't know whether or not this is modern DC, where they went to DC, or a former DC county that is actually now the Virginia county of Alexandria. And the problem is because right before DC retrocession, I believe, Alexandria, Virginia was actually still part of DC, and it was actually just called Alexandria County. And while looking at maps of that original county, there are a couple of 7 streets in that part of DC, or what is now Alexandria. As of right now, there's only one street called 7th Street in the current DC, and that's actually right next to the White House. So I'm pretty sure that they didn't get that far, because I think there would have been a major story based off of this. Because of a mob that kicked them and pushed them out, they ended up going through to Montgomery County. This is why I pretty much believe that they were actually in Alexandria at the time and were able to move through to Montgomery County. There they were actually stopped by a militia group, back then known as the Montgomery Volunteers. Word has spread of this mass assortment of African Americans who were trying to escape from their slave plantations, and so they were actually stopped and held up at Montgomery County. Now, before these enslaved people did leave, they managed to obtain weapons, not what you might call extremely lethal weapons like guns or everything, because that wasn't available, so more or less farm equipment. And so with that, there was a major standoff, in which now we call that the Rockville Pike resistance. Basically, you had one side, which was the formerly enslaved people who were trying to gain their freedom, and then you had the other side of basically a militia trying to either take them down, slow them down, or capture them. Based off of the news source, however, there are conflicting evidences stating about how many casualties there were on both sides. Again, whether or not, if we were looking at a abolitionist-leaning news source, there were more casualties on the enslavement side, on those former enslaved people. However, on the pro-militia side, anti-slavery more or less, there was actually a few casualties and injuries that had occurred on the militia side. However, there were multiple newspapers that I was able to find that actually pointed to a majority of the injuries and casualties actually occurring to the enslaved people.
On July 8th, after the Montgomery County resistance and after the escaped persons were ultimately overcome by the Montgomery County volunteers or the local militia, Mark Caesar was captured and brought back to Port Tobacco and remained in the jail. Both Mark Caesar and Bill Wheeler were tried in the Port Tobacco courthouse. Mark Caesar's trial resulted with him being tried for aiding and abetting a slave escape, and he was then put into the Maryland State Penitentiary for the span of 40 years. However, he unfortunately passed away 5 years later in 1850, and his death was stated as being brought on by consumption. Bill Wheeler was also found guilty, and he was given the death penalty by hanging. However, in 1846, he managed to escape the Port Tobacco jail, and his whereabouts afterward are currently unknown. Whether he made it to freedom or what happened to him after this is up for future researchers to find out. So the implication for this escape in Maryland, especially in the southern counties, were these slaveholder meetings that were held by people that either their enslaved person left and escaped successfully or not. They were imprisoned or taken back. We don't know the story of every single person that was involved, unfortunately. But during these meetings, there were resolutions to tighten control over both the enslaved Black population and the free Black population. And especially in Charles County at this time, there was a very large free Black population. And so this really affected the lives of many people. And we can assume that was, in the short term as well as in the long term. And this reaction by the slaveholders was really typical of acts of resistance, whether it was something bigger like this escape or an everyday act of resistance. Typically, the control over enslaved people increased, which would influence things like their ability to sell things that they may have been able to grow in their gardens, their ability to travel between plantations, their ability to practice religion on the plantation. They may have not been able to do that after this. And I think this just really speaks to the bravery and the planning of Bill Wheeler and Mark Caesar, as well as everybody else involved, whether they were in the escape or perhaps they stayed on the plantations, other areas, and they helped because they knew the consequences. This was a way for the white enslavers to maintain control because they knew that resisting, leaving, escaping would affect their friends and family, and ultimately they wouldn't be able to take everybody with them. It had to be, in small numbers. They might not make it out. So I think it just speaks to the noble sacrifice that they made so that not necessarily they could have a better life, but definitely generations after them could have a better life.